All right, everybody, welcome back to section 2 of our new public policy course. And in this section, we're going to be talking about the policy environment. And obviously, this is going to be a little bit focused on the United States, but a lot of this is applicable to other countries and other areas as well. So if you're not in the United States, feel free to look up and gauge how much of this applies to your country or your area as well. Now, when the United States was first formed and the Constitution was first written, the framers created three different branches of government: the legislative, i.e., Congress, the executive, the president, and the courts, or judicial branch, right? And these three different parts of the government had separate areas of responsibility, separate powers, separate areas of expertise. Although often this was a little bit vague. So, for instance, the Constitution establishes the Supreme Court, but doesn't really say what the Supreme Court's job is. So, it was an early Supreme Court case, Marbury versus Madison, which is maybe the most famous Supreme Court case of all time, where the Supreme Court kind of gave itself the job of judicial review. And exactly what is supposed to be under Congress's purview versus the president versus the courts is often very clear and very unambiguous, but sometimes reaches into that kind of vagueness and ambiguity that makes it a little bit difficult to tell whose job is exactly what and who's allowed to do this versus allowed to do that. And important with this kind of separation into the three different sections of government is the idea of checks and balances. The founding fathers didn't want any one of the three to get too powerful, to be able to do too much, because again, they had just fought a revolution against the King of England, who had been able to do pretty much whatever he liked with that country. So they wanted to create this kind of decentralized seats of power, right? So each one of those three groups has some form of power or control over the other two. A few different examples of that are things like the president can veto laws that are passed by Congress. When the president appoints somebody to either a cabinet position or a federal court, they need the approval of part of the legislature, right? Congress has the power to create new or different courts, right? So each one of those three different levels of government, or three different parts of government, have power over the other two, which means that power is not concentrated in any one of the three. Each one has different powers, and no one of the three can get so controlling or so influential or so powerful that they kind of make the other two irrelevant. Another thing this has done is it has forced these three different parts of government to cooperate. Right? They can't get anything done unless the other two are also on board. So it forces not only these three parts of government to be non all powerful, but forces them to work together if they want to get anything done. Now, there are also three levels of government in the United States. There's the local, there's the state, and there's the federal. Right? And the Constitution really only lays out the powers of the federal government. It also, like, the only time that the lower two levels get any kind of mention at all is in the 9th and 10th Amendments, which were passed soon after the original Constitution was passed. And in those, they say that the rights outlined in the Constitution aren't an exhaustive list, and thus people have more rights than just the ones that are explicitly listed in the Constitution and the first 8 amendments. And it says that all powers not given to the federal government via this Constitution are reserved for the states or for the people. So this was kind of the founding fathers' way of saying we also have to have a lot of power, not just in these three separate parts of the federal government, but we also want to give power to the local and state levels of government as well. For the first 150 years of the country, the federal government was very weak comparatively. They didn't have a lot of power. They didn't do a lot. Obviously, things like foreign relations and stuff that has to be done by a national government, but not a lot outside of that. But then there were two parts of the Constitution that the federal government has used, especially over the course of the 20th century, to get more powerful and more influential and have more of a matter of input on everything from the everyday lives of Americans to kind of the world stage as a whole, right? And that's the Necessary and Proper Clause and the Commerce Clause. And the Necessary and Proper Clause says something along the lines, this is not a direct quote, but something along the lines of Congress shall have the power to pass laws to do all of these things that they deem to be necessary and proper. And that's a little bit vague, right? And the other one is it says that the federal government has the power to regulate interstate commerce. And exactly what qualifies as interstate commerce has gotten broader and broader over the almost 250-year history of the United States. Now, again, kind of similar to the rise in federal power, there's also been a change in how this whole federal system of government has been seen and how it works when it comes to the other two levels of government. So, for the 18th and 19th centuries, it was more of what's called a dual federalism relationship, meaning the federal government did what the federal government is supposed to do, the state governments and the local governments did what they were supposed to do, and they kind of had two very separate spheres of influence and two different jobs. So there wasn't a lot of kind of interaction between the two. But over the course of the 20th century, we've moved much more into this whole idea of cooperative federalism, which means that these different levels of government work together to govern people, to pass laws, to make sure that, you know, crime is down and jobs are up and all those things. So they've kind of ceased to become these separate, distinct organizations that only do their job and not impact the other person's job. And now they're more kind of working together, and it's kind of blurred the line between what's a state responsibility versus a federal responsibility versus a local responsibility. Now, we're also going to have to make a distinction between micropolitics and macropolitics. So micropolitics is kind of politics that impacts one small geographic area or one small group of people or a very small group of companies or whatever. These are usually kind of fly under the radar, so to speak. Micropolitics is about, you know, it's a huge percentage of the politics that actually happens, and the politics that actually affect people's lives, but it doesn't get a lot of national attention usually. It's one small thing passed to help some small area or small group of people. Whereas macropolitics is kind of the large, you know, affects an entire region of the country or the whole country, right? It's kind of the major things that get lots of media attention, you know, Supreme Court decisions and presidential appointments and this stuff. That's all macropolitics. Another thing we have to talk about before we go into more in depth on this subject is iron triangles. Iron triangles was responsible for a lot of micropolitics and even some macropolitics for a long time over the course of our country's history. And an iron triangle is kind of the fancy colloquial term used to describe the relationship between a particular congressional committee or subcommittee, some administrative agency, and some interest group. And they would get together and the three of them would work on how to deal with some specific, usually relatively small on a national scale issue. So, you know, if we want to put in a new power plant in a certain spot, in a certain state, you know, the subcommittee that's responsible for energy and the administrative agency, say the EPA or the Department of Energy, and then the company that wants to build the power plant would get together, figure out what the regulations are going to be, figure out how the paperwork's all going to get done, whether they're going to get approval or not. And it's really this very small group of businesses or individuals and legislators and regulators that get together and made essentially all of the decisions about how that process was going to work, right? But in the late 20th century and into the 21st century, this has kind of become a little less common. And one of the big reasons for that is because of the concept of regulatory capture. And regulatory capture refers to the process by which the groups or organizations that are supposed to be being regulated have an undue and overwhelming ability to affect what those regulations are and how those regulations work. So essentially, if, say, the oil companies become way too powerful in dictating how oil companies are going to be regulated, that would be regulatory capture. So if they make lots of friends with the particular Congress people who are on these committees, and the administrators in that administrative agency are former members of those businesses, or want to be hired by those businesses when they're no longer in government service or whatever, that creates a process called regulatory capture, where now it's essentially those companies or those organizations or those groups that are in charge of regulating themselves. And that is obviously not a good thing. So those iron triangles have kind of slowly become less and less common. But we're going to go ahead and take a break. We'll be right back.